Hi, and welcome back. Modular systems are often associated with analog sound, but digital modules opened a lot of possibilities, especially when it comes to things like creative sequencing and complex modulation. Today, we're having a closer look at Droid, an ecosystem that pushes creative modular control to the next level. In this video, I explain what Droid is, how it works, and what you can do with it. There's a lot to cover, so let's dive right in. Let's start from the top. What is Droid? What exactly are we looking at here? Droid is a lineup of eurorack modules created by a musician who goes by the name Der Mann mit der Maschine, or the man with the machine, who has a background in software engineering. The way Droid combines easy-to-use power and hardware control from an efficient musician's perspective is what makes it special. At the core of the lineup, you find the Droid Master, which is this module. This is the one module you need to get started, the brain of the lineup, so to say, and the only module that can function standalone. All other modules in the lineup are optional expansions. For example, this P2B8 that offers 2 pots and 8 buttons, hence the name. These can be used to control the master module. To be clear though, the master isn't a hardware unit with a blank memory. This module can perform basically any CV task. The only thing it doesn't do is audio. For example, it can generate control voltages like creative LFOs. Create complex envelopes. It can do interesting utilitarian functions like quantizing, mixing and logic, but it can also do complex melodic and pattern sequencing. The tasks Droid can perform are called circuits, and you can compare these to entire eurorack modules. Here's an incomplete list of some of my favorite circuits to give you a quick impression. All of these have extensive options. You can pause this if you like, but I'll explain, mention, and use a bunch of these throughout the video. The beauty is that Droid can basically run as many of these circuits as you like, so you don't have to use it as either an LFO or a sequencer, for example. You can mix and match circuits, have them interact with each other, and create entire complicated patches. For example, you can create multiple envelopes and have them trigger each other. You can add a random voltage to modulate the decay stage of those envelopes, and at the same time use an LFO through a quantizer to generate melodies. You can create entire patches in Droid just like you would on a modular. So you can end up with a Droid patch that has the exact features you like. To have that interact with your modular, on the master module you can find 8 CV inputs here and 8 CV outputs here. These can take or send voltages from minus to plus 10 volt. They are very precise and all have LEDs here on the top to visualize the voltages coming in or going out. Finally, on the master module, there's a slot for an SD card that holds the instructions for your custom patches, and a button to load the patch from the card into the memory of the module. So the next question is crucial. How do you get access to all the power and circuits? How do you tell Droid what to do? To create your own custom patches, you can use a free application called Droid Forge. Droid Forge offers an easy-to-use interface to create your own patches. It can be used to add circuits to your patch, define the parameters for the circuits in detail. You can have circuits interact with each other by creating virtual patch cables, define what every knob and button in your setup does, and so on. There's a lot going on here, but don't worry for now. I'll take you through the basics of this in the last chapter of this video. I do want to be honest though. If you want to enjoy Droid in all its depth, you do need to spend a couple of days exploring possibilities and learning a few things. You need a bit of patience to get the maximum reward. When you do though, the biggest limitation is your imagination. You can keep adding, changing and fine-tuning your patch and use expanders where needed. For example, the G8 expander here, which offers 8 more jacks that can be used as either in or outputs for gates or triggers. Or the P2B8 or P10 that offer hardware control over the circuits running inside your patch. For example, you can use a knob to control the speed of an LFO, or use a selection of buttons to program a trigger pattern. Everything is possible and customizable. There are other expanders available that I don't use in this video, like the X7, offering USB and MIDI control, the B32 with 32 buttons, great for manual trigger patterns, or the motorized fader module. But I'll show you can start and do a lot with a small setup. So Droid gives you the possibility to create a module or setup with the exact features you want, both when it comes to functionality as well as hardware control. Let's dive a bit deeper. With the amount of available circuits and the flexibility they have, it's easy to set up creative patches. In this chapter, I share a few ideas to show how you can use Droid to create powerful modules. In this chapter, I use the Droid Master module and just one controller, a P2B8. If you want to start with a compact setup, I highly recommend this combination. The Master module is mandatory, but the one expander will give you a huge amount of extra fun. At the same time, this is a compact setup and we won't lose ourselves too quickly in endless options. When exploring Droid, it's good to start small, for example with the LFO circuit. The first thing I did was create a simple dual LFO. I'll show you how I created this patch in Droid Forge in the final chapter. And here it is. You can see the first LFO here at output 1, now patched to a filter. I set up the first pot to control the speed of that LFO. Then there's also a second LFO at the second input here. It's internally connected to modulate the speed of the first LFO. And I can control the amount of modulation with this pot. This is a simple example, but it's important to understand all input parameters on Droid can be modulated, both with external signals through CV inputs on the master, as well as internal virtual patch cables, or of course a combination of those. I immediately started thinking about how I could combine a few simple circuits to create a module I would actually use in my modular setup. Let me show you a slightly more complex patch based on LFO circuits. This patch contains 8 LFOs with a few interesting features. The LFOs are divided in 2 groups. The first 4 outputs are for the first group of 4 LFOs, with each LFO cycling at half the speed of the previous one, creating interesting tempo divisions. Outputs 5 to 8 are for the second group of 4 LFOs. Again with each LFO at half the speed of the previous one. The frequency of both first LFOs in the group is set with this knob controlling the internal clock. You can see the lights showing the outputs of all 8 sine LFOs. However, I set the frequency range of the second group slightly larger than the first group, so both groups are ever so slightly out of sync. The master clock is shown at input here, but I set it up so you can override it with an external clock input. When you do, group 1 will follow the external clock, but the second group will still follow the internal clock. On top of that, input jacks 2 to 8 can be used to modulate the frequency of LFOs 2 to 8. You can use external signals, but you can also manually patch modulation between these LFOs, of course. The second pot here acts as a global attenuator for all those inputs at the same time. Finally, each of the 8 buttons here can be used to cycle through 4 stages to select the waveform for each of the 8 LFOs, selecting either sine, saw, ramp or square. I know that's a lot of info, but this example shows a patch that's a powerful standalone module. I'd be interested in this module even if it had just these features. Here's a quick example where this droid patch is used as the only modulation source in a massive drone patch with 2 voices. The beauty is, of course, that everything is forever customizable. You could also use these buttons to select different time divisions for the LFOs, or turn synchronization between group 1 and 2 on or off. You could use the second part to dial in phase offset for LFOs, dedicate inputs to modulate output volume, and so on. To give you more ideas, throughout the video I will point at a few circuits and parameters in Droid Forge, because it will simply take way too long to demonstrate everything. For example, here you see that first patch with 2 simple LFOs. If I right-click and say New Parameter, a screen pops up showing all available parameters for that circuit. Looking at the LFO, there's things like rate and level, but there's also randomize, giving different output levels for each cycle. You can offset and/or phase shift the LFO, you can set and modulate the pulse width of the square, and you can also use the skew to shape the waves, or even use waveform, which gives you the possibility to morph through the shapes. Remember, all of these can be modulated with external voltages as well as internal signals from other circuits. From the LFO, I moved on to the envelope circuit, called contour, and more creative uses for paths and buttons. In this patch, there are 2 groups of 3 envelopes each. The first envelope in the group can be triggered via an external input or button. The second and third in the group are triggered internally with the end of release trigger of the one before. Each envelope is slightly slower than the one before as well. All 6 envelopes have their own output, but I also added a mix output for each group. A quick look at the contour circuit shows there are a lot of options here. You can either gate or trigger the circuit. There are detailed restart and re-trigger options. You can make a full ADSR envelope, but there's also a pre-delay and hold stage. You can control the output level and even the shape of the envelope. Again, they can all be modulated, so you can easily create an ADSR with voltage control over all the stages, for example. Or use an internal LFO to subtly modulate the shape or decay of an envelope. There are also multiple outputs and end-of triggers for all stages. Looking back at my patch, the controller can be used to control the envelopes. In the LFO patch, I used buttons to cycle through 4 values. In this case, these buttons are used as manual gate, to fire off the first envelope in the group, triggering the others. These buttons are used as an on-off switch. With the light on, it allows for the third envelope to re-trigger the first in the group, creating a looping setup. And these buttons turn on a natural sounding decay in output level between the envelopes. But you can also assign multiple buttons into a group. In this case, I created a group with just these 2 top buttons, so you can select only one at a time. This selects which of the envelope groups is being modulated with the control paths. When group 1 is selected, the paths set the attack and decay of the envelopes in the first group. But when group 2 is selected, the first part set both the attack and release, and the second part the whole time of the envelopes in the second group. So you can use one part for multiple tasks, which is very powerful. Of course, it remembers the setting made for the group not selected, and you can go back anytime to adjust. That made me wonder if I could do it the other way around as well, and use buttons for multiple things. And of course, the answer was yes. In this patch, I used the algoquencer circuit to create a simple 8-step pattern sequencer. You can see the sequence going forward because I used an internal LFO as a clock, which can be overruled with an external clock via this input. This first pattern is going to the first output, in this case triggering a kick, and I can program it easily. However, I use this part to select one of 5 pages, so I can turn it up a bit and scroll to the next empty pattern, used on output 2 to program a head, for example. Scroll to the next, program a snare, scroll to the next, and program a trigger for a bass line. It will remember all the patterns. I also added a 5th page that I set up as individual buttons. This vertical row acts as mutes for each of the patterns. The second row selects whether that pattern is following a variation amount set by the second part. Fully to the left there is no variation, to the right there is more, but only applied to the patterns that are selected. The algoquencer is probably the most powerful and versatile circuit of Droid, and can be used for creative melodic sequencing as well. I'll use it more in the next chapter. But first, I quickly want to go over a few more circuits, just to trigger your imagination a bit. Let's hit the circuit button. This brings up a series of tabs with all circuits. Under modulation, we already seen the contour and LFO, but there's also a random number generator and a physical spring simulator. Under sequencing, I mentioned the algoquencer, but there's also things like the arpeggiator, a nice 8-step sequencer inspired by the IntelliGel Metropolis, and Euclid, a Euclidean rhythm generator I like. I'll come back to that in the next chapter as well. The tab with CV processing shows a long list of utilities, like the crossfader, CV looper, mixers, as well as things like sample and hold and slew limiting. These circuits allow for creative routings and combining multiple circuits and signals in complex patches. Under control, you will find circuits associated with controller inputs. For example, to set up buttons into groups or create paths with multiple functions like I showed earlier. Then there are clock and trigger circuits like the Bernoulli gate, burst generator, clock divider and trigger delay. The math and logic tab give you even more control in complex patches. For example, to make multiple copies of a signal, use if-else logic and so on. Under pitch, there's a musical quantizer that's very powerful, and finally, if you have the X7 expander, there are complex MIDI circuits you can set up. When you manage to wrap your head around a couple of these circuits, you can start to combine them and create complex setups. One of the most powerful features of Droid is that you don't have to choose between different functions. You can run and use many circuits at the same time in a complex patch and create a custom control service. For this chapter, I used the Droid Live Kit, a nice packed bundle that comes with the Droid Master module, the G8 expander, offering 8 more jacks that can be used as in and outputs for gates or triggers, as well as 2 P2B8 and 2 P10 controllers, and a few useful gadgets like a card reader. This is a very nice package if you like to use Droid for performances. To show you what's possible with this setup, I will take you through 2 patches I made. One for a more straightforward techno setup, and one for a more generative melodic setup. Here I installed the Live Kit into a compact case I'm working on, designed for raw improvised techno. The idea is that Droid takes care of all modulation, control and sequencing, and the other modules are just there for sound generation. I want to give you an impression of how Droid can be used as a custom control service, so I won't go over all details of my patch, but let's dive straight in. Simply put, I use this half of the controls for percussive parts. The bottom raw is used for the clock. I made 3 fixed clock speeds. And with this knob active, the clock comes from an internal LFO that I can control with this knob. For the percussion, I use multiple instances of Euclid, a Euclidean sequencer. Let me quickly explain that. It can be used by setting the length of a pattern, for example 8, the number of active beats divided over the pattern, like 2, 3, or 4. And you can also control the offset for the first beat, shifting the entire pattern. In this patch, there are 3 percussive sections based on this. The kick is the simplest, with a mute here and 3 buttons to select pattern variations. However, the kick is also triggering an inverted envelope that is patched to multiple places and used to duck sounds throughout the patch. I set the decay of that envelope with this knob. The heads have a mute button here and are created by sending a simple decay envelope to an external VCA with noise. I can use this knob to control the number of beats in the bar, starting with 4, and they are offset to match with the kick. I can use this knob to set the length of the decay, and finally use settings here to select an amount of randomization to the decay. The third pattern is used on a simple percussive sample. Again, it has a mute and the knob to control the number of beats in the bar, this time starting with 1. With the controls here, I set the offset for this pattern, so I can align it with the kick or heads or place it in between. The right side of the setup is used to control modulation sources for the 2 tonal voices. Both voices have a clock-triggered envelope modulating the filter, and I use these controls to set the attack and decay time for those. Both voices also have an LFO to add some modulation. I use these 4 controls here to set things like speed, shape, and depth for those LFOs. The first voice has an additional envelope triggered once in a bar, and I can set the attack and decay time for that envelope with these 2 knobs. This all gives me good control over both voices. Finally, these 8 pots are used as a simple 8-step sequencer. The setup you see here is very much under construction, and I show that on purpose. I plan to add sample players, for example. When I do though, Droid can change and grow with me, which is very valuable. I can add more pattern generation, different control or modulation, and all without buying or changing a single thing. For example, I could easily add more depth to sequencing. To dive more into that though, I want to show you the next patch. This setup is more focused on melodic and generative sounds. To make clear what's going on in this case, I use just 2 oscillators, each going through a filter, and 2 sample players. I use these few modules for 2 melodic and 2 percussive voices. Looking at Droid, this patch is essentially 4 algoquencer circuits used in slightly different ways. Again, I use 1 knob to scroll through 5 pages, 4 16-step patterns, and 1 control page. The first pattern is used for a simple kick sample, nothing fancy there. The second pattern is used to trigger the second sample player, but here I use a trick I like and explained in this older video if you want to learn more. In short, the algoquencer creates a random 16-step CV pattern that is used to select samples within a bank. So just a single sample player is used. The pattern is looped, but I can use the control page and press this button to generate a new pattern, or use these buttons to add a little or a lot of randomization to the current pattern. Of course, I also make mutes for both the kick and drums. The third and fourth pattern are used for a bass line and lead line. On the right side, again, I have an attack and decay generator for each of the voices, as well as an LFO each. To create melodies, I use this set of 8 controls to dial in a bass line. There are 16 steps, so the controls are repeated. But of course, I can create an interesting trigger pattern to break that up. Then, with this little knob, I can add a bit of random variation to the pattern. It keeps changing in a certain amount if this knob is up, all the way to complete random. But I can always dial it back and return to the pattern I programmed. The lead voice is similar to drums and generated by a random 16-step CV sequence, but quantized of course. To add variations, I use slightly different controls. This knob adds variations to the current pattern, but in a non-destructive way. I can dial it back and return to the pattern I had. This knob morphs the current pattern into the next, and the next, and the next, and so on. But anytime I like something, I can dial it back, keep the pattern, or add non-destructive variations to it with this knob. Similar to drums, I can also generate a completely new pattern. To finish it off, I use one knob as master clock. One knob to create variations to both drum patterns, either adding or removing triggers relative to the program pattern. And this knob does the same, but for the 2 melodic voices. To be honest, these 2 examples are still pretty simple patches. You can go much deeper. I also wanted to demonstrate things in a simple setup. But when using Droid more, you will probably find that using 4 big pods just for simple attack decay envelopes, for example, is underusing the power. You can also use a simple external envelope for that and use the knobs to dive deeper in pattern or other internal signal control. The algoquencer itself has a lot more functions as well, like you can see here. For example, you can create branches, navigate patterns, use offbeat patterns, and there's a very easy way to add accent triggers as well. I don't want this video to be too long though, and I also want to show you Droid Forge. Because creating patches is a crucial part of Droid, I want to give you a realistic idea of how it works. This is just scratching the surface, but let's create a simple patch. This is the main interface of Droid Forge. At the top here, you see a visual representation of the modules. On the far left, you have your master controls like load, save, and add circuit. And here on the bottom, you find all the details and parameters of the used circuits. Beside the master module, you see the two expanders that offer in and outputs, the G8 and X7. For now, I won't use those, but you can right-click here and add controllers. This brings up a menu with all available controllers. And for now, I select one P2B8. Just press OK and the controller is added to the setup. Then let's go ahead and create an LFO circuit. The circuit button on the left opens the menu with all available circuits. Here are all modulation circuits, the LFO and envelope included. Other tabs show circuits for sequencing, CV processing, and a lot more as you've seen before. For now, let's go to modulation, select the LFO and press OK. This adds the LFO circuit to your patch. Now you can see the list of basic parameters for this LFO. In blue, you see the parameters that you need to define with an input value. You can set the speed of the LFO in Hertz. Let's leave it at 1, which corresponds to 1 cycle per second. You can also set the output level with the value between 0 and 1, where 1 is the maximum output. Finally, you can decide whether you want a unipolar or bipolar LFO. Let's turn bipolar on by entering a 1. In red, you see the outputs of a circuit. In this case, the different waveforms. Let's start easy by selecting the sine wave and then an output on the Droid master module. Now, you see output 4 defined in the list, and you see that output is used on the image as well. You can easily drag and drop used in and outputs to other jacks. Let's bring it to output 1. At any time, you can press save and save your patch as a text file on an SD card. By the way, the file created is a plain text file. For the LFO we just made, that looks like this. It defines the expander we use, the LFO circuit, and the custom parameters. This is how patches were made before Droid Forge was available. And if you're hardcore, you can still completely write a patch in any text editor. With the SD card in the module, just press the button to load the patch you made. And there's our 1 Hz sine LFO. You can see the light visualizing the voltage on output 1. Awesome. But let's go back and turn this into a more useful LFO. For example, let's say you want to use this knob to control the frequency of the LFO. Simply select Hertz and then the part you want to use. Again, you see the potentiometer defined in the list as well as on the image. To make this work well, you need to know that every pot on Droid generates a value between 0 and 1. You can actually see the values printed on the module. So now you can use the pot to set the frequency from 0, which is a frozen LFO, to 1 Hz, or 1 cycle per second. To change the range, you can use a simple equation possible on all inputs on Droid, following the same basic rule. The value in the first field here is multiplied by a second value. And on top of that, here you see the plus sign, a third value can be added. So if you multiply the pot's value by 10, you get a range of 0 to 10 Hz, creating a useful range for an LFO. Nice. The control you have over the circuits goes very deep. You can right-click any circuit and select New Parameter. This shows a window with all available inputs and outputs for that circuit. You can see Hertz, level, and bipolar are already selected, but there are many more parameters available, like tap tempo, pulse width, and waveform. If you select any of these, you see an explanation of it on the right. So this window functions as a manual as well. The possibility to create virtual patch cables between the circuits adds an incredible amount of depth and interaction. To demonstrate this, I add another LFO circuit to our patch. Let's make it a slower LFO at 0.2 Hz and make it bipolar as well. Now I want to use the sine output to modulate the speed of the LFO we already had. For that, I add another parameter to that LFO called rate, which can be used in combination with the control over hertz we already had. Then you can simply create a virtual patch cable by right-clicking an output and select Create Internal Cable. Then I select the destination, press Enter, give the cable a unique name, for example sine 1, and done. The sine wave is now modulating the rate of the other LFO. To add control over the depth, I can select the second input field and then the second part on the controller. Because if you remember, now the incoming sine wave is multiplied by the part's value, from 0 to 1. So the second part effectively becomes an attenuator for the incoming signal. To finish this patch, let's select the triangle output of the modulating LFO and send it to output 2. I hope all this gives you a good idea of what you can do with Droid. If this video does well and people are interested, I'm happy to make more videos on Droid, as I genuinely enjoy using it and there's a lot more to do. So let me know in the comments. In the meantime, if you want to see more modular videos, you can browse through any of these playlists. Also, smash that like, subscribe and bell button if you want to see more modular content from me. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching and see you next time.